The Blacksmith's Choice by Everett Cole. The hammer struck the red-hot iron with a resounding clang that echoed through the sweltering forge. Sweat beaded on Thomas McKenna's brow as he worked the metal, his muscled arms moving with practiced precision. The piece he was crafting, a delicate iron rose, was unlike anything he'd ever attempted before, but then again, nothing about his life in Cedar Ridge had been ordinary since she'd arrived. Margaret Sinclair stood in the doorway of his smithy, her traveling dress still bearing traces of the long journey from Boston. The afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and Thomas found himself pausing mid-strike, the hammer suspended in his grip. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her cultured voice cutting through the din of his workshop, "I believe we need to discuss our arrangement." Thomas set down his tools and wiped his hands on his leather apron. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret had stepped off the stagecoach, responding to his advertisement for a wife. 3 weeks of awkward conversations over shared meals, tentative walks through town, and careful negotiations about their future together. Yet standing here now, Thomas realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who was supposed to become his bride in just 4 days. "Of course, Miss Sinclair. Please, come in." He gestured to the rough wooden chair he'd made for visitors, though precious few ever stopped by his forge for conversation. Margaret lifted her skirts delicately and settled into the chair, her spine straight as a rifle barrel. Everything about her spoke of refinement and education, qualities that seemed as foreign in Cedar Ridge as snow in July. The town was rough around the edges, populated mostly by miners, ranchers, and the occasional drifter. Thomas often wondered what had possessed him to place that advertisement in the Boston papers. "I've been thinking," Margaret began, folding her hands in her lap, "about what you told me regarding your expectations for marriage." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. During their first meeting, he'd been brutally honest about his needs: a companion, someone to help manage his household, perhaps eventually a mother for the children he hoped to have. It had been a practical conversation, devoid of romantic sentiment. Looking at her now, he wondered if his directness had been a mistake. "And what conclusions have you reached?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him want to squirm. "I think you're lying to yourself, Mr. McKenna." The words hit him like a physical blow. "I beg your pardon? You speak of marriage as if it were a business transaction. Yet you've spent the better part of 3 weeks crafting that iron rose." She nodded toward his workbench where the delicate metalwork caught the light from the forge. "A practical man doesn't spend precious hours on such frivolity." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the blazing fire. "How do you know that's not commissioned work?" "Because I asked Mrs. Patterson at the general store. She said you've never made anything like it before. She also mentioned that you've been asking questions about my preferences, what flowers I like, what books I read, whether I take sugar in my tea." Damn Eleanor Patterson and her loose tongue. Thomas crossed his arms over his chest, suddenly feeling exposed. "I was simply trying to be a considerate host." "Were you?" Margaret rose from the chair and moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the lavender water she wore. "Or were you trying to court me properly, despite your claims that this marriage is merely a matter of convenience?" The question hung between them like smoke from the forge. Thomas found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her lips curved slightly upward, as if she were suppressing a smile. When had he started noticing such things? "You're a forthright woman, Miss Sinclair. I found it saves considerable time and confusion. So I'll ask you directly, Mr. McKenna, do you want a wife or a housekeeper?" The question should have been simple to answer. For months after placing the advertisement, he'd been certain of what he wanted: a partnership based on mutual benefit and respect. Someone to share the burden of daily life and provide companionship during the long winter months. Romance was for poets and dreamers, not for a 32-year-old blacksmith whose hands were permanently stained with soot and whose back ached from years of hard labor. But standing here now, with Margaret looking at him expectantly, Thomas realized his certainty had been crumbling bit by bit over the past 3 weeks. It had started the day she'd arrived, when she'd stepped down from the stagecoach and looked around Cedar Ridge with curiosity rather than disappointment. Most women from back east would have taken one look at the dusty main street and the rough-hewn buildings and demanded to be put on the next stage heading home. Not Margaret. She'd surveyed their little town with the same careful attention she might have given to a painting in a museum, noting details others would overlook. The way the mountains framed the valley, how the evening light turned the wooden storefronts golden, the pride with which the townspeople maintained their small community. "I find myself uncertain," Thomas admitted, the words coming out more gravelly than usual. "When I placed that advertisement, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. But I've discovered that wanting something and understanding why you want it are two very different things." Margaret stepped closer still, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "What have you discovered about what you want?" Thomas looked down at his hands, roughened by years of working metal, then back at her face. "I've discovered that I look forward to our evening walks more than I should. That I find myself listening for your laughter when you're talking with Mrs. Patterson or helping Mrs. Chen with her children. That I've been lying awake at night wondering what it would be like to—" He stopped himself, heat flooding his face. "To what?" Margaret's voice had gone soft, encouraging. "To know you. Really know you. Not just your preferences for tea or flowers, but what makes you laugh, what keeps you awake at night, what dreams you had to give up to answer my advertisement." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the cooling forge. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I had a position as a governess for a wealthy family in Boston," she said. "The children were sweet, the work was pleasant, and I had a comfortable room in a beautiful house. I could have stayed there indefinitely." "Then why didn't you?" Margaret moved to the window that looked out over the main street of Cedar Ridge. "Because I realized I was living someone else's life, caring for someone else's children, managing someone else's household, invisible except when needed. When I saw your advertisement, it wasn't the offer of marriage that intrigued me, it was the possibility of having a life that was truly my own." Thomas joined her at the window, careful to maintain a respectable distance. "And now that you're here, now I find myself facing the same question I'm asking you. Do I want a husband or simply independence?" They stood side by side, watching the activity on the street below. A wagon loaded with supplies for the general store rolled past, followed by two young boys racing their horses toward the edge of town. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her store to sweep the front steps, pausing to wave at someone down the street. "It's a good town," Thomas said. "The people are decent, hardworking. They'll accept you as one of their own once we're married." "And if we don't marry?" The question sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the approaching evening. "Do you have doubts about our arrangement?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Thomas began to fear the worst. Finally, she turned to face him fully. "I have doubts about settling for an arrangement when what I really want is a marriage." The distinction hit him with surprising force. "I'm not sure I understand the difference. An arrangement is what we agreed to in our letters: mutual benefit, shared responsibilities, companionship. A marriage is what happens when two people choose each other, not out of necessity but out of genuine affection and shared hopes for the future." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like tumblers falling into place in a complex lock. "And which do you want?" "I want to wake up each morning knowing that the man beside me is glad I'm there. I want to share not just the work of daily life but the small joys and disappointments that make up a real partnership. I want to be chosen, Mr. McKenna, not simply accepted." The honesty in her voice made Thomas's throat tight. He'd spent so many years focused on survival, on building his business and establishing his place in the community, that he'd forgotten what it meant to truly want something beyond the basic necessities of life. "I've been afraid," he said, the admission surprising him with its truth. "My parents had a marriage of convenience. They were polite to each other, ran their household efficiently, raised their children to be responsible citizens. But I never saw them laugh together or share a secret or reach for each other's hand just because they wanted the connection." "And you don't want that for yourself?" "I didn't think I had the right to want more." Thomas turned from the window to face her directly. "I'm a simple man, Miss Sinclair. I work with my hands, I smell of smoke and metal more often than not, and my idea of fine conversation is discussing the merits of different types of horseshoe nails. What could I possibly offer a woman of your education and refinement beyond security and stability?" Margaret's laugh was soft but genuine. "You truly don't know, do you?" "Know what?" She moved closer, close enough to place her hand on his arm. Even through the fabric of his shirt, he could feel the warmth of her touch. "You notice things," she said. "The way you've observed what I like and dislike, how you've made an effort to accommodate my preferences without being asked. You listen when I speak, really listen, not just waiting for your turn to talk. You've created beauty with your hands. That rose you made is more lovely than any flower that grows naturally." Thomas looked down at her hand on his arm, marveling at how right it felt there. "And," Margaret continued, "you've shown me more consideration and respect in 3 weeks than any man ever has. You haven't tried to rush our courtship or pressure me into intimacy. You've given me space to make my own choice while making it clear that you value my presence in your life." "I want you to be happy," Thomas said simply, "whether that's with me or—" Margaret silenced him by placing her finger gently against his lips. "What if I said I want to try for more than an arrangement? What if I said I want to see if we can build something real together?" Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "I'd say I've been hoping you'd want that too." "Then perhaps we should start over." Margaret smiled, and Thomas realized it was the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "Hello, Mr. McKenna. I'm Margaret Sinclair, and I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance." Despite the solemnity of the moment, Thomas found himself grinning. "Hello, Miss Sinclair. I'm Thomas McKenna, and the pleasure is entirely mine." "Now then," Margaret said, her eyes sparkling with mischief, "I believe you were about to tell me what you've been lying awake thinking about." Thomas felt his cheeks heat again, but this time he didn't look away. "I've been wondering what it would be like to court you properly. To bring you flowers that I picked myself, to take you driving in a proper carriage instead of walking dusty streets, to," he paused, gathering courage, "to hold your hand without worrying about propriety." In response, Margaret slipped her hand into his. Her fingers were soft but strong, fitting perfectly between his own rough ones. "I've been wondering similar things," she confessed. "What it would be like to cook a meal for someone who truly appreciated it, to tend a garden that was my own, to fall asleep knowing someone cared whether I was safe and content." They stood together in the fading light of the forge, hands clasped, surrounded by the tools of Thomas's trade. It wasn't the most romantic setting, but somehow it felt perfect, honest and real in a way that elaborate courtship rituals never could be. "Margaret," Thomas said, testing the sound of her given name on his lips. "May I call you Margaret?" "I'd like that very much, Thomas." The sound of his name and her voice sent warmth spreading through his chest. "Margaret, would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you properly? I know we have only 4 days until the wedding, but—" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Though I think we should extend our timeline a bit. I'd like to know the man I'm marrying, not just the arrangement we've made." Thomas felt relief flood through him. "How long would you like? What would you say to Christmas? That gives us 3 months to truly get to know each other, to build something real. And if at Christmas you decide I'm not the husband you want—" Margaret squeezed his hand. "Then we'll face that when the time comes. But Thomas, I have a feeling I'm going to want to keep you." As if to seal the new understanding between them, Margaret rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. It was barely more than a brush of lips against skin, but it sent electricity coursing through Thomas's entire body. "Now," Margaret said, stepping back with a pleased smile, "why don't you show me how you made that rose? I've always been curious about metalwork." Thomas felt his heart swell with something he was finally willing to name as joy. "It would be my pleasure." As he began explaining the intricacies of shaping heated metal, showing Margaret how to hold the smaller tools, and describing the patience required for delicate work, Thomas realized that he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Not just a wife or a housekeeper or even a companion, but a true partner. Someone who saw value in his craft, who listened with genuine interest to his explanations, who asked thoughtful questions and offered insights he hadn't considered. The weeks that followed were filled with discovery. Thomas learned that Margaret had a wicked sense of humor that emerged once she felt comfortable, that she could recite poetry from memory while kneading bread, and that she had a gift for seeing beauty in unexpected places. Margaret discovered that Thomas was far more well-read than his rough exterior suggested, that he had a talent for storytelling that kept her entertained during their evening walks, and that his quiet strength extended far beyond his physical capabilities. They took long rides into the surrounding countryside, with Thomas teaching Margaret to handle a horse properly and Margaret sharing stories of her life in Boston. They worked side by side in the garden behind Thomas' house, planning what vegetables they might grow together come spring. Most evenings found them on the front porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains and talking about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. By the time October arrived with its crisp mornings and brilliant foliage, both Thomas and Margaret knew they'd found something rare and precious. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface of their careful courtship had deepened into genuine love, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. On a particularly beautiful morning, as they walked together toward the church where they'd finally exchanged vows, Margaret paused to look back at the forge where their real courtship had begun. "Do you have any regrets?" Thomas asked, following her gaze. Margaret turned to him with a radiant smile. "Only that we wasted 3 weeks being polite strangers when we could have been getting to know each other." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then, let's not waste any more time." As they continued toward their wedding, Thomas reflected on how wrong he'd been about what he wanted. He'd thought he needed an arrangement, a practical solution to loneliness and domestic concerns. Instead, he'd found love, messy, complicated, wonderful love that made every day brighter and every challenge easier to bear. The church bells began to ring as they approached, calling the community together to witness their union. Thomas knew that the people of Cedar Ridge would remember this as the day the blacksmith married the lady from Boston. But for him, it would always be the day he learned the difference between settling for what seemed reasonable and reaching for what made life truly worth living. "Ready?" Margaret asked as they paused at the church steps. Thomas squeezed her hand, marveling once again at how perfectly it fit in his. "I've been ready since the day you asked me what I really wanted." Together, they walked into their future, leaving behind the careful negotiations of strangers and embracing the beautiful uncertainty of two people who had chosen to build a life based on love rather than mere convenience. The iron rose that had started it all sat on the mantelpiece of their home, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the hottest fires and the most patient craftsmanship. Like their marriage, it was strong enough to last a lifetime, yet delicate enough to appreciate the beauty in everyday moments. Years later, when neighbors asked about the secret to their obviously happy marriage, Thomas and Margaret would exchange knowing glances before Thomas would say, "We decided to stop settling for an arrangement and reach for something real." And Margaret would add, with that mischievous smile Thomas never tired of seeing, "Sometimes the best things in life are worth the wait."